Jesus makes it sound and look so easy. And he is asking a lot, isn't it? You know, it's one of those Sundays that I was tempted to change the gospel. I'll be in big trouble. I like what Jesus says. It's beautiful, it's inspiring. It's how I want to live and the way I want our world to be. But what do you and I do when we meet someone who is unlovable, hurts us through unforgivable act, or really deserve our judgment and condemnation? It's often not this gospel. I wonder if this gospel makes sense in today's world of enemies, haters, cursors, and abusers. I'm not saying that we don't need today's gospel. We need it more than ever. But is it really possible to live like that? Story that we heard in our first reading today, the story of David's response to Saul's hostility, is one of the most instructive stories about how to respond to hatred. King Saul opposed David and sought many ways to kill him. And David, having all the opportunity to strike and harm Saul while his archenemy was asleep, he wisely refused to kill Saul because it was not right to kill the anointed king. Abishai, David's soldier, could not understand why David should hesitate in crushing his enemy. Eventually, Saul and David will be reconciled, with Saul asking forgiveness and blessing from David. And Jesus instructed his listeners about how to relate with enemies in this 6th chapter in the Gospel of St. Luke. But Jesus does not only teach us about forgiving the enemy, but also asks his followers, all of us, to go the extra mile to love and pray for our enemies. Give to everyone who asks of you, says Jesus. What is more, Jesus reiterates the famous golden rule which says, do to others what you would have them do to you. Notably, Jesus took his listeners beyond the conventional golden rule by teaching his disciples to go the extra mile. The extra mile is to love without expecting anything in return, and to love even those who ignore them. And that is not all. He asked us to be generous, not only to those from whom we can get something in return, but even to people who cannot afford to pay back such generosity. Jesus wants his followers to imitate God, who is constantly kind even to both the ungrateful and selfish. He had more to say to his disciples. He instructed them to be merciful as God is merciful, and that they should neither judge nor condemn others. More still, he wanted them to understand that when they forgive others, God will forgive them their sins, and that when they are generous, that God will be generous to them. But wait a minute. Is love of enemy not equivalent to telling us to love a scorpion or a snake that has every intention of harming us? We have the natural tendency to attack our enemies before they harm us, or at least to keep them at arm's length, so that they do not have the opportunity to hurt us. It takes supernatural grace for anyone to love his enemies, let alone bless and pray for them. To err is human, to forgive divine, said the poet Alexander Pope. To love one's enemies is effectively impossible, even unimaginable for almost everyone. It is difficult enough to love our friends or loved ones consistently and purely. But when still reeling from the impact of a savage blow, when angered at an insult flung into our face, or when utterly devastated by the suffering or even the death of a loved one at the hands of an aggressor, how can we possibly entertain sentiments of love, the ground from which forgiveness grows? When our instincts for self-preservation is stronger than anything except the desire for retaliation or revenge, how can we possibly find sufficient self-control to be able to entertain feelings of empathy? And when we are so beside ourselves, we can only scream with moral outrage. How can we possibly hear or be attentive to the person of the aggressor, much less acknowledge his or her human dignity or worth? No, at such times, to love one's enemy seems quite impossible, and mercy is unthinkable. In the Old Testament, especially in the Psalms, we find several prayers crying to God to deliver us from the hands of enemies or opponents and adversaries. For example, a psalmist prays against the enemy, saying, let his days be few and let another take his office. Psalm 109, verse 8. And adds, O God, break his teeth in their mouths. I'm not actually inventing this. You can find this in Psalm 8, in Psalm 58, verse 6. Remember this, Psalm 58, verse 6. O God, break their teeth in their mouths. I don't want to hear that in the petitions later on. So the question is, how could Jesus ask us to love our dreaded and dangerous enemies, if we have some? Some prominent authors have attempted to explain the wisdom in loving our enemies. Foremost it comes to mind, is Martin Luther King Jr., a civil rights activist leader, who says that Jesus asked us to love our enemies because darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. That hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And from a philosophical perspective, Friedrich Nietzsche says that we should love our enemies because they bring out the best in us. And according to G.K. Chesterton, one of the greatest writers in the 20th century, he says, the Bible tells us to love our neighbor and also to love our enemies, probably because they are generally the same people. There's a wisdom to that. In other words, we cannot do this simply by using our own human capacity. We need to turn directly to God, the font and origin of love. Because God can make the impossible possible. The world is complex. Relationships are difficult. Life is fragile. Politics is toxic. That's why we need today's gospel. That's why it matters. But it's not easy. You and I may not be able to diminish or take away the pain of the world, but neither do we have to add to it. That's the bottom line for me in today's gospel. Are you and I adding to the pain of the world, to the life of another? And if we are, what needs to change? How can we do things differently? How might we stop? Will we stop? Because Jesus tells us that to be merciful as the Father is merciful, we can believe that loving our enemies is possible. God's kindness and mercy are graces to which we can be open because God lives in us and with us. Faith assures us that we are capable of cooperating with grace. Today, we are invited to be among those who really hear what Jesus is saying. Amen.